great to see a lot of familiar faces. I've been in this area since 1984, and I'm amazed how much this area has grown. We've had some great economic times, we've had some bad economic times, and through it all, the industry in particular, as far as telecom is concerned, this continues to grow. A big part of that is AT&T and what Bill does, but also a big part of it is local university, UT Dallas, and what David has done as president at UT Dallas and continues to do. So I'm very happy to be here today. I thought I'd kind of piece together something that looks like a historical sketch of the telecom industry, particularly as you look at it from the aspect of innovation, but also as you look at it from a local perspective, because so many of us have been part of that industry for the last few decades or so. So my talk today primarily looks at how the nature of evolution of innovation has evolved in telecom, where I see it going, and as part of that, what I think are some of the challenges we will face in trying to transform not just the role of the supplier, the role of the service provider, AT&T that is, also the role of several players in the ecosystem, because I do believe over the next 10 years there's a big transformation ahead of us. Let me start out with looking at a couple of things. When I started my career in 1980, I had just graduated from the University of Pittsburgh, and I went to Bell Labs in New Jersey. I would never have guessed that over the next 30 years, the industry would go through the transformation that it did. Because here was an industry that had largely remained the same structurally from 1876, when Alexander Graham Bell got his patent on the telephone, up to 1984, when by decree and the settlement that AT&T had with the Department of Justice, they gave up a big portion of AT&T just so that they could get into the computer industry. That was essentially the antitrust settlement that was done in 1984. So we have a phase there for nearly 100 years, 100 plus in fact, where the industry is regulated. Then a second phase between 84 and 95, when a lot of players emerged. This is a big player. You have foreign companies move in here. How many of you work for Fujitsu? I certainly know that quite a few Fujitsu people. Fujitsu saw an opportunity, global telecom player moved into this area. Likewise with Ericsson, likewise with Alcatel-Lucent. So many of these came in at that time, in addition to a large number of small suppliers who organically grew up in this area. And lastly, the phase after 95, when the internet emerges as a major factor in our lives, and as part of that, the internet goes right on top of the telecom network and the consequences of that. So if you keep these three phases in the back of your mind, I'd like to just kind of talk a little bit about some of the changes in our innovation model, and we'll come back and answer any questions if you have. Primarily, we are looking to understand what happens over the next decade so that we can get the best economic advantage for this region to make sure that the roles we continue to play emerge as the primary roles. So the Bell system, the Bell AT&T Labs, which traces its roots back to Bell Telephone Labs, was started somewhere around 1910, 1915. And for the first phase, because it was a regulated industry, the primary problem that we were trying to solve was the problem of distance. You went from being able to make local calls to being able to make transcontinental calls, being able to make international calls. And of course, every problem they solved with starting with the science, working out the engineering, and then trying to understand how you do the manufacturing and the large-scale deployment. And in the process, AT&T Labs collected 8 Nobel Prizes, several fundamental discoveries in physics, in astronomy, in metallurgy, because they were attacking the problem at its root. But that particular innovation model is totally a dinosaur today, because the world doesn't wait for AT&T Labs to solve the problem and then say this is the solution. And the real reason for that is, as far as the consumer is concerned, as far as the end user is concerned, the demand that the end user creates is primarily setting the clock for us. If we don't do something at the pace of the end user, we are basically out of the game because the end user finds another way to get it. Case in point, Facebook introduces messaging. That messaging primarily is a service that is equivalent to our text message. Our text messaging is $8 to $10 billion of revenue. Overnight it disappears because 600 million Facebook users can now message back and forth, and they don't need to use a cell phone company's messaging plan. What do the cell phone companies do? They react by giving you a data plan. Doesn't matter whether you use it for voice, you use it for messaging, doesn't matter, it's a data plan. We don't care as long as you use your bits. So these kind of transformations are happening all the time. The big difference is it's now the demand from the consumer that's driving the pace of the change. Previously it used to be the clock set by the supplier of the service. You get to phase two, which was the period between divestiture, that was 1984, to the period just before the dawn of the internet, which is 1995. And in this phase, it's all about scale. Voice becomes global. You go roughly from 70 million, let me take that back, more like 140 million telephone customers in the 70s all over the world to very easily 700 million telephone customers. You find out that computers need to be connected. You find out it's rather easy to send data over this network because this network is largely digital. So the big thing you see there is the emergence of large-scale voice and data networks and a whole lot of technology that underpins this. And as part of this, I talked earlier about many of the companies moving into this area. So you had Fujitsu, which is an optical transmission company. You certainly had, not necessarily in this area, but over in the United States, several companies that emerged to solve the problem of data networking, data transmission. And along the way, the World Wide Web was introduced in the early 90s, which was waiting for the browser that showed up in 93. But basically what you see is the stage being set for the internet to arrive. Let's look at what happens in the next model. Well, one of the problems with the previous model was that it really didn't solve the problem of reach. I need to get to a particular place so that I can access the network. And that's really not what the demand forces desire. They want the network to come to you wherever you are. And what does that mean? That means the whole problem of cellular and mobility and the devices or the tablets and the iPhones, the smartphones and the feature phones that kind of tie into that. So I've laid down there some of the different phases of what happened in the network. Every one of these upgrades in cellular generations is a massive upgrade. For us alone, to do a complete conversion from 3G cellular, which was launched in 2001, and to 4G cellular, and our conversion in AT&T's network affecting 300 million users in the US would probably be complete by 2014. That's, conservatively speaking, is a $30 to $50 billion investment. And it's the equivalent of multiple Hoover dams going in. But what is amazing is that these transitions in the generations of technology are happening at a pace, and again, that pace is set by the consumer. The demand is set by the consumer. It's happening at a pace that is so incredible. Just 10 years ago, we would have thought that the risk is great and we don't want to embark on it. But today, we don't even look into that. We just say we've got to get it done. Doesn't matter how we get it done. We launch a transition from one generation to another, and the whole company lines up and gets that executed. So the internet today is one network. There's absolutely no reason to believe that there's nothing you cannot do on this network. There's no business model that's excluded. There's no end device that's excluded. There's no application that's excluded. And I'd like for you to mull over this, because if you really find an example, I'd really like to know. Because every bit of thinking I've done, I can't think of anything. Of course, you've got to be reasonable. There are certain things you really can't do on the internet. And it's not fun anyway. We try to do that on the internet. But I really would challenge you that this is where we are headed. This is absolutely where we are headed. So with that as the primary force that's driving this evolution, let's look and see what happens over the next 10 years. Firstly, my first premise is the future is all about touch. Now that we've solved the problem of distance, we've solved the problem of scale, solved the problem of reach, it's all about touch. I reach someone, I need to touch the person. What does touch mean? It means being able to do whatever the person wants on the network. The person wants access to his or her data. We give it to the person when they want. The person wants the network to be smart about managing the person's life. You're in a position to do that. So if you really look at it, going back to the mid-90s, when we first had mobility at scale, when we first started the internet Web 1.0, it's been a steady evolution and progression towards this end state where everybody gets the touch they want. It's not just a simple touch, because that's reach, really. It's everybody gets the touch they want from the net. Just for edification, WebRTC is a new standard that fundamentally becomes the basic driver behind Web 3.0. Web 1.0 was primarily the user trying to get to content on the web. Web 2.0 was the user being able to place content on the web. To look at social networking, Web 3.0 is all about being able to do real-time communication, browser to browser on the net. The pace of innovation is driven by a lot of other secondary factors in multiple industries. Certainly you all know about Moore's Law and the ability to double your performance every 18 months, whether it's 18 months, 24 months, that's a minor detail. But Moore's Law fundamentally drives a lot of our performance, our ability to transform the network. We have seen, going back to several generations, handsets progressing at the rate of 2x every 2 years. Network traffic, which literally doubles every year, progressing at the rate of 4x every 4 years. The most important thing in all of this is applications are absolutely fluid. And the underlying network needs to be positioned so that they can handle applications, the fluid applications, as and when they show up. This, the network today is not equipped to do. When you complain about your iPhone not working, whether it's AT&T's network or Verizon's network or T-Mobile network, there's a couple of issues. One is, do you have coverage, which is a radio problem, but do you also have the capacity you need? And that is an insatiable capacity demand that's created by applications, and the short answer is no. There's no way we can give you the capacity you need from now forever. It just isn't possible, because what you need, when you need it, has to be prioritized. And the fluid applications somehow, at least in this phase of the network, have driven a capacity demand on the network that's just not being met, can't be met. So in this context, when we look at the future, our challenge is how do we transform our network to be able to handle these fluid applications. Along the way, past 10 years, I don't want to talk about Apple as a 10-year-old company, it really is much older than that. But if you go back to 1995, certainly there was no Facebook, certainly there was no Twitter. Google was a couple of graduate students in Stanford trying to work out algorithms for doing library research. Apple was a $5 stock. I think in 1995, Apple may have been $7, $8. Today, Apple is $600, topping $600. No share splits. It's the same reference base. You can imagine where these companies were back in 1995. One of the things I think the companies have taught us, those who've been traditional telecom companies, is to understand what operating model means and what is its efficiency. If I look at these three players, there's Google, there's AT&T, and there's Apple. And just picture yourself with an Apple iPhone, you use AT&T's network, and of course you want to get to Google so that you can do something with your smartphone. In this ecosystem, there are three players, and nobody can survive without the other. You take AT&T out of it, your Apple smartphone is really a dumb phone. You take AT&T out of it, Google is pretty much useless. And so when you put this together, and you say, what is this ecosystem? Well, the median US household spending on a class of services that kind of use this ecosystem is $600 a month. Any which way you look at it, you know. Good economic times, it may be $650. Bad economic times, like the ones we have right now, it may be $550. You're talking $600 that the three players and other surrogates who play in the same ecosystem are going to tap into. And yet, what's shown there in the blue graph is the cash generated by these companies. What's shown in the red, the maroon, is the capital investment of these companies. So if I look at AT&T, we invest $20 billion a year. We get $37 billion of cash, and it's cash from operations. So you take out all your operating expenses, your salaries, your commissions, all that. So it is really a good measure. And you can see our ratio of the two is 1.77. Apple invests $4 to $5 billion of cash and generates more cash than we do. And Google invests slightly under $4.5 billion of cash, and their cash flow is almost half as much as ours. So when I look at this chart, I say, well, it's an ecosystem. Normally in a stable ecosystem, all three players have operating models which kind of are in equilibrium. And here we have a situation where one of the players is really not doing as well as the other two. And this, I think, is creating some sort of instability in the system that can't last forever. Okay? So today, Google stock and AT&T stock combined is less than Apple stock. And of course, Apple will show us a way to get their stock from $600 to $1,000 here one of these days. But I do believe that this is kind of important because it means that the three players will try to get into each other's turf just so that these ratios equalize. So what do we have to do to respond to these two? Our problem is not that we don't have cash flow. We have very good cash flow. Our problem is we invest too much money for that cash flow. And one of the first things we do is, of course, we squeeze the suppliers. You understand that? You understand that, right? Yeah, that's right. So many of you in this room, I must say Roland is over there, so you're talking about that. Many of us in this room are in that ecosystem, basically. And they wonder why we don't get our proportionate share of benefits from the technology revolutions we're seeing. And part of the reason is we have an imbalance in the business operating models. So what is it that we're trying to do? Well, we are trying to transform the company so that instead of just doing internal development of finished services, remember, for 100 years, we took 10 years to just perfect the technology that we would roll out into the network. Today, in those 10 years, we are going through major generations